finally, we're going to hear from Marianne Martin.
Here we go. Okay, so I had figured that by the time I got up, a lot of the issues would be covered. So I decided that I would, and also with encouragement from Michelle, focus my comments as a view from a biomedical researcher. And I put biomedical in there. I, like Sabina, am a neuroscientist because I think biomedicine in particular has several unique issues, specifically in the way that it publishes and the amount that it publishes that require a special attention. So I think it's always important to remember why we publish. And primarily, we publish our information because we want to make our findings known. And we want them to be known so that they can be built upon, right? We know that that's the way science works. You constantly build on previous work. And if that work is unpublished or in your head and never communicated, then it does no good to anybody. And we want other scientists to use this, but increasingly, right, society, others, policy decisions are being made on top of the work that is being published. But also, we've heard this mentioned several times already, prestige, power, and money. I first heard the term prestige economy, that's what science was, I think from Alan Leshner from AAAS way back when, probably 20 or 30 years ago. But our reputation as scientists is established by not just what we publish, but where we publish in the exclusive journals, the single name journals, and being able to get into those selective journals, as you saw in the survey, is considered a mark of quality. And I think that we know that this has distorted the scientific literature, that in fact the basic communication functions for a very long time became subordinate to the fact that we wanted to publish only in the best journals and the selective journals. And so where you published became a filter on what was actually allowed to get in to the scientific corpus. And that's, of course, we know has caused troubles because we have stopped thinking in many ways inside, especially the big competitive research universities, that our primary job, if we get money from funders, is to give an accounting of what we did with that money. And oftentimes, the only place that that happens is in the final progress report that we've got to give to the funders, where, again, it's not useful. So there's been a large push, I think, for open access and other things and alternate forms of publication, as we've heard, so that the bar to recovering this information is not so high, and that we start to recognize that one of the reasons we are funded is to produce information and knowledge and make that available. And I don't know how many of you saw this recent piece on AI researchers and how the Nature was going to launch a new journal on AI, and a lot of the leading researchers said, no, we don't want you to do that. We don't want it to be distorted by this idea that there's this competitive closed access journal that we now have to get into that's going to limit access to the information, not just by other researchers, but there's a basic statement here that says locking up our research papers behind a paywall would make public scrutiny more difficult. We hear about AI every day. We hear about both its promise and also its perils, and these researchers want to make sure that the public also has access to this so that they can understand what's going on inside of a field. So I think that one of my main regrets as a researcher very early on, I have not regretted the things that I published, but I've regretted a lot the things that I haven't published because I never understood until relatively late in my career that it wasn't just about publishing my important things and the things that were worthy, but it was about publishing everything that I had done so that other people could build on top of it. And so all of the efforts in preprints and others are very welcome developments. So one of the themes here is what are the costs of open access, but I think one of the themes of my talks is going to be, well, what are the costs of unrecovered, of non-open access, of closed access, unrecovered research? You may have seen this from The Lancet a few years ago, and they estimated that there's unpublished dark data that nobody can get access to. It's in file drawers, never been published anywhere, and they said, yeah, it's about $240 billion. So there's a lot of money that's locked up in these file drawers in people's heads that can have no impact. And a lot of this is negative results, replications. Again, the things that people think are not worthy to spend the time and effort to make sure that it can get out there, or that journals, as the arbiter of what is allowed to go in there, are not worthy of being published. One of the reasons I say that I'm also editor-in-chief of a journal is because I I said, I understand from an editorial perspective. I get research all the time. Brain and Behavior is a sound science journal. But I look at it and I'm like, if I want to build the reputation of my journal, this is not the paper I want to publish. It's a replication. It's not interesting. But I do it anyway because, I believe that you have to practice what you preach and say, this is a place where this can actually get into the scientific literature. So as a funder, I can see why they very much, again, want to increase their return on investment. They paid for this research. They would like to see it deposited somewhere. The Chan Zuckerberg Institute was one of the major, or foundation, investors into bioRxiv, into the preprint servers, because they recognized, again, that this was one way for research that otherwise would not be published to get into the scientific literature, into the scientific corpora. And I was recently on a thesis committee where the student came back to defend his thesis. He'd moved on. He'd gotten a job someplace else in Silicon Valley. We knew he was never going to publish his research. We said, please put it in bioRxiv so at least somebody has access to it. That's very important. And I was very pleased to see that his thesis committee agreed. They said, yes, this is the way it's going. It has to have a public presence. It has to have some place where we can get access to it. So we see the rise of preprint servers across many different fields. Also, and this has been touched upon by the previous speakers, recognition for non-traditional scholarly outputs. In many ways, publishing data and code is where the funders have been for many, many years already. It is the funders, NIH and others, NSF, that are supporting the data repositories where the data that underlies scientific papers is deposited. And I consider them one of the ecosystem of publishers for the 21st century because they are making this data public in the very essence of the word publishing. So in many ways, I feel that funders have been in this game for a very long time already. And why? Because again, they want this data to be available so that it can be reused. But a second reason also for putting it in is not just so that other people can use this. And I think that that was touched on in the innovative products in the morning quite a bit. The number of AI, full text access products that were out there was really starting to increase. And this, of course, the fourth paradigm came out way back when in the 90s by Jim Gray, but recognizing that science, like everything else, is really entering into a data-intensive period. And I liked this quote from Michael Nielsen in his book, Reinventing Discovery. An unaided human's ability to process large data sets is comparable to a dog's ability to do arithmetic and not much more valuable. We increasingly need to be assisted by computational tools, AI, whatever you want to call it, machine learning, to be able to digest and actually use what is in the scientific literature. So you may have seen something called the FAIR Guiding Principles for Scientific Data. I'm assuming most of you have heard of FAIR. These are high-level principles to make data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And the key thing is this is for both humans and machines. It emphasizes both human ability to find, access, and use this data, and machines to computationally access it through APIs and other types of activities. And most people recognize that it's really not just scientific data in the way that we might understand it in an Excel spreadsheet, but it's really all research outputs need to be amenable and available for this type of computational processing. And one can look at the literature, because most scientific data still occurs in the literature. That is where we talk about it as a big data set. And I want to focus on PubMed. PubMed lists about 28 million abstracts. It's not that easy to actually find out. NIH, recognizing that it needed to increase the access to its research, of course, launched PubMed Central. There's about 4 million articles in PubMed Central where humans can get full text access to it. But interestingly, only about 2 million of those, or half of those, are considered part of the open access subset, which means it has a liberal enough license that you are allowed to use it for text mining or natural language processing. So we are able to access computationally without too much difficulty, about 2 million of these 28 million articles. And why is that important in biomedicine? Well, the unit of a finding inside of a paper in biomedicine is extremely tiny relative to biomedical science as a whole. So you may have an entire paper on one small part of a pathway that, of course, is part of thousands of signaling molecules that are spread out over huge distances inside of organisms. So each thing is only meant to cover an extremely tiny fraction of what we know about a system. And if we can't put those together, if we cannot concatenate them together, we will never understand what's going on. And the reason why I think you see a lot of neuroscientists in this domain is neuroscience has had a horrible track record in having any impact on neurodegenerative, neurotraumatic, neuropsychiatric diseases. And I think one of the reasons is that this reductionist approach has not served neuroscience extremely well. There is nothing more integrated and networked than the brain, and to try to understand it in these small units is just impossible. And it is beyond any individual capacity to understand this. We have to have computational tools, which means we have to have computational access. So I think this 2 million papers is the most heavily mined scientific literature in the world, I suspect, but it's woefully incomplete compared to what we know. So again, I want to ask the question, not what are the costs of open access, but what are the costs of closed access? What is the cost of us not being able to easily get access to this? Well, the corpus is fractured. So when I first started in text mining, I said, oh, that's great. UCSD's library is fabulous. We have access to all these scientific papers. We're going to go ahead and mine them. And they said, oh, no, you're not, because the library signed a contract with the publishers that said you're not allowed to computationally access these papers. You can have a graduate student download them each one by one, crack the PDFs, and then do it, but we're not going to give you computational access. I said, well, that's stupid. That is not the way this is meant to work, right? Now, a lot of the publishers put up APIs, but they are not adequate for text mining, the ones that we're allowed to get. They don't give you access. You don't know what you've mined. You don't get fragments of the text, and I'm sorry, but that's not acceptable. And why is that so important? Even in a tiny field, spinal muscular atrophy, where I started, where there were about 1,500 papers at the time that we started doing text mining. That was scattered across about 6 or 7 or 8 different publishers. No publisher owns the corpus on Alzheimer's. And increasingly we know that the answers to Alzheimer's may not be in Alzheimer's, but it may be in Parkinson's, or it may be in something else altogether. So this leads to a case where the corpus is fractured. What are the costs to society? And I know this is a little bit hard to read. This is, again, a personal story. I, like many of you probably in this room, are dealing with elderly relatives. You're dealing with people who are having trouble. And when we had an elderly relative who was in a nursing home, they developed a problem. Of course, people come to me because I'm a scientist. I'm like, okay. I'm sending them all these papers. They're like, how come I have to pay $35 for this? How come I have to pay $39 for this? And I'm like, oops. Oh, yeah, I keep forgetting, right? I keep forgetting you don't have access to these things. So I have a choice. I can download the PDF and send them, or you're allowed to take the subset that's in PubMed Central. I tell them about PubMed Central. It's great that research shows up a year after it's published, but if your relative's in the nursing home and you have to make a life or death decision, you really don't like that. And I think that there's a conceit that the public at large, oh, they don't understand it, we're going to abstract it, we're going to write news stories. I myself as a scientist know that what's going on in those reporting sites is woefully inadequate compared to what's in the literature itself. And I think it's a conceit to say that people out there would not want access to this information. And finally, since everything is personal with me, there's a cost to researchers and institutions. So we've already seen that PubMed Central has to replicate what's already published someplace else, okay? Now, there are reasons for that, having it centralized. Text mining is one of them. But I've noticed that at the University of California, we have our eScholarship repository. When I published in an open access journal, which I try to do as much as possible, I published my article, it's automatically deposited in PubMed Central, and UC eScholarship grabs that in and everybody's happy. When I published in closed access, mostly this is automated in PubMed Central. I remember the early days where I had to go and actually manually upload my article, which was time and effort on my part. But now, I still, in our eScholarship, I have to upload a preprint, not the publisher's proofs, but a preprint, which means I have to go back, figure out what all the changes are, make those again, and upload them. And so we're basically having possibly 3 different versions of articles, 3 different publishing workflows, and nothing makes me angrier as a researcher than when my time is wasted on doing work over and over and over again, which could only be done once. So basically, those were the main points that I wanted to make, and I thank you for your attention.